He was never meant to be king. He wasn't the firstborn, nor the most prepared. But when his elder brother Arthur died suddenly in 1502, the crown fell into the hands of a charming, athletic, bright-eyed 17-year-old named Henry. And with it, so did the fate of an entire nation. What no one could predict back then, not even Henry himself, was that behind the princely smile hid a hunger that would turn into cruelty, and a fear that would one day drown his court in blood. Before we continue, subscribe now. This story will take you into the mind of a monarch who rewrote history with a sword in one hand and a broken heart in the other. At first, England adored him. Henry VIII was everything his people had dreamed of. Tall, confident, fluent in Latin, and passionate about music and jousting, he looked more like a knight from a poem than a politician. The nobles praised his intellect. The commoners cheered his energy. And the church, at least in the beginning, saw in him a protector of the faith. But beneath the surface, young Henry was restless. He had been raised as the spare, not the heir. That meant fewer expectations, but also fewer lessons in restraint. His upbringing was filled with books, music, theology, and pride, but almost no political discipline. So when he inherited the throne at just 18, with unimaginable power and wealth, he began to rule more like a performer than a king. The court was his stage, and he demanded applause. He quickly married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, a political match with deep Spanish alliances and the blessing of the Pope. For a while, they were a true power couple. Catherine was intelligent, respected, and popular. She gave Henry stability, but not what he desired most: a son. Their children kept dying. Only one, a girl, survived: Mary. And something in Henry began to twist. He saw himself as chosen by God, and if God wasn't giving him a son through Catherine, then maybe he needed a new wife. But divorcing a queen wasn't just scandalous, it was forbidden. Still, Henry didn't flinch. He began quietly laying the groundwork to break not just a marriage, but the very religious authority of Europe. In his mind, the world had to change, for him. And in the shadows of his court, a young woman named Anne Boleyn started to whisper the words that would ignite a revolution. Anne Boleyn didn't enter Henry's life with the beauty of a temptress or the power of a queen. She arrived with wit, ambition, and danger. She was no ordinary courtier. Raised in the royal circles of France and the Netherlands, Anne returned to England polished, fluent in politics, and smart enough to understand exactly what Henry wanted and what he lacked. He noticed her almost immediately. But Anne was not like her sister Mary, who had already been Henry's mistress and faded from the court's memory like a spent candle. Anne refused to sleep with the king. She flirted, she challenged him, she stepped away when he stepped too close. And Henry, used to being obeyed, became obsessed. To have her, he needed more than lust. He needed legitimacy. He began to speak of marriage. That meant one thing: Catherine had to go. But the church would not permit a divorce. Rome was clear. Marriage was sacred. And the Pope would not side with Henry, especially not against Catherine, who was the aunt of the powerful Emperor Charles V. For a moment, it seemed even a king could be denied. But Henry was not just a king. He was now a man obsessed. Obsessed with Anne. Obsessed with a son. Obsessed with bending the world to his will. He began what would become the most shocking political and religious gamble in English history: the break with Rome. Helped by advisors like Thomas Cromwell and the ambitious Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This wasn't just paperwork, it was revolution. Monasteries were closed, church lands were seized, Catholic loyalists were silenced or executed, and in secret, Henry married Anne Boleyn. Catherine was cast aside, stripped of her title, and banished from court. Her daughter Mary was declared illegitimate. Anne was crowned queen, a ceremony laced with triumph and tension. People whispered that she was a witch, a manipulator, a curse. Others called her England's future. She soon gave birth to a daughter. The child, named Elizabeth, would one day become England's greatest monarch. But in that moment, Henry felt the world collapse again. He had destroyed his marriage, defied the Pope, and restructured a kingdom for another daughter. Anne was quick to promise more children. She became politically active, stepping into roles queens rarely did. She made enemies, many. At court, the smiles turned sharp. Henry began to grow distant. His gaze wandered again. Then Anne miscarried. A boy. And the same mind that had once risked everything for her now began to calculate what it would take to erase her from history. She had given him hope, then disappointment, then fear. Anne Boleyn had been the spark of Henry's revolution. But kings do not forgive sparks that fail to ignite flames. By 1536, only 3 years after her coronation, Anne stood on a narrowing ledge. Her enemies, nobles, clergymen, even members of her own family, sensed the shift in Henry's favor. And in Tudor England, when a monarch's heart turned cold, the blade was never far behind. Anne wasn't innocent. She played the court like a chessboard. She made enemies with her sharp tongue and unflinching opinions. She argued with Henry in public, insulted his advisors, and demanded influence traditionally denied to queens. But none of that should have led to her death, unless someone needed her gone, and someone did. Henry's eye had found another woman, Jane Seymour. Quiet, obedient, pale in both beauty and voice, Jane was everything Anne was not. And most importantly, she came from a powerful Catholic-leaning family that could offer Henry stability and maybe finally a male heir. But Anne was still queen. She still wore the crown. So how do you remove a queen without scandal? You call her a traitor. In May of 1536, Anne was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The charges? Adultery, incest, treason, her supposed lovers, 5 men, including her own brother. The evidence? Almost non-existent. The reality? It didn't matter. Henry wanted her gone. And Thomas Cromwell, the architect of so many of Henry's brutal decisions, delivered what the king desired. The trial was a performance. Witnesses lied. The accused men were tortured. The outcome was predetermined. Anne stood trial with her head held high. She denied every charge. Her grace unnerved the court. Some wept. Others averted their eyes. The verdict, guilty. Sentence, death. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold. She wore a simple gray gown and a red petticoat, the colors of martyrdom. Her final words were composed, almost surreal. I die the king's faithful servant, but God's first. The sword fell silently, a French blade brought specially for her beheading. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days later. Anne's name was erased from paintings, her emblems removed from court, her supporters scattered. But the daughter she bore, the one Henry dismissed, would one day rise from the ashes of this execution and change the course of England forever. But for now, the court was silent. And Henry, for the moment, was satisfied. Jane Seymour gave Henry what no other woman had, a son. In 1537, she delivered Edward, a healthy boy. The bells of London rang for days. Feasts were held. Henry finally felt vindicated. His gamble had paid off. His legacy was secured. Jane became the perfect queen in the eyes of the court, silent, obedient, and fertile. And then she died. 12 days after childbirth, Jane succumbed to postpartum infection. Henry was devastated. He buried her with full honors and later ordered that he be buried beside her when his time came. She remained the only wife he mourned. But kings do not remain widowers for long, especially kings as restless as Henry. What followed was less romance, more strategy. In 1540, under Cromwell's guidance, Henry agreed to marry Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman whose Protestant ties could strengthen England's position in Europe. But when Anne arrived, Henry recoiled. He claimed she looked nothing like the portrait he'd been shown, a diplomatic disaster in silk and lace. The marriage was never consummated. Within months, it was annulled. Anne wisely accepted her fate without protest. She was granted a generous settlement, 2 estates, and the honorary title of King's beloved sister. She survived Henry, and even dined with him occasionally. Cromwell wasn't so lucky. The failed match with Anne of Cleves gave Henry an excuse. Cromwell, once his most trusted advisor, had made too many enemies. His power had grown too vast. Accused of treason and heresy, he was arrested and executed. The same machinery of accusation he had once mastered now turned on him. But Henry's appetite remained. Later that same year, he married Catherine Howard, a teenager, vibrant and flirtatious, and the cousin of Anne Boleyn. At first, she delighted the aging king. She danced, laughed, whispered to him like no one else dared. For a moment, he seemed reborn. Then came the rumors. Catherine had not been a virgin at marriage. Worse, she had taken a lover while queen. In 1542, she was arrested and interrogated. The evidence this time was real, or at least close enough. She confessed. She begged for mercy. None came. At the Tower of London, she asked for the block to be brought to her cell the night before her execution, so she could practice placing her head upon it. She was beheaded at dawn, not yet 20 years old. Henry VIII, now swollen with age and rage, moved through wives and counselors like a knife through fabric. The court learned to fear silence more than words. Smiles grew thinner. Everyone, from noble to servant, knew the truth. To be close to the king was to be close to danger. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was no longer the radiant prince of Europe. His legs were ulcerated, his body bloated, and his spirit twisted beyond recognition. He was only in his 50s, but he moved like a man decades older. A special mechanism had to be built just so he could be lifted onto a horse. His once golden hair thinned, his eyes grew darker, more suspicious. And his enemies? They were everywhere, or so he believed. The court had become a theater of fear. Nobles whispered carefully. Servants learned to breathe quietly. One wrong word, one wrong look, and it could mean the scaffold. Henry had created a world where love, loyalty, and truth were all suspect. Only obedience was safe. Even his closest advisors, those who had helped him build this brutal machinery, lived in constant fear of becoming its next victims. His mood swung wildly. On some days, he was jovial, reminiscing about jousts and music. On others, he lashed out at those who displeased him. Parliament passed laws declaring it treason to even think ill of the king. People were executed not for what they did, but for what they might do. And yet, even now, Henry married again. Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed noblewoman with a sharp mind and a calm voice, became his 6th wife in 1543. She was not chosen for beauty or bloodlines. She was chosen because she could manage him. And she did. She nursed him through infections. She soothed his temper. She even helped reconcile him, cautiously, with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. But even Catherine Parr was not safe. When it became clear she held Protestant sympathies, a warrant for her arrest was drawn up in secret. Only a desperate, tearful confrontation with Henry saved her, for the moment. She had learned how to play the part, obedient wife by day, cautious reformer in shadow. Outside the palace, England groaned under the weight of its king's whims. The monasteries were gone. The church had been bent to Henry's will, but the faith of the people remained confused and fractured. The treasury strained. Wars with France and Scotland drained gold and blood. The once flourishing court became a sickly echo of its past splendor. And yet, Henry refused to loosen his grip. He had become a man of contradictions, obsessed with legacy, yet quick to destroy those closest to him. Surrounded by wealth, yet impoverishing his nation. Feared by all, yet loved by none. Behind the walls of Whitehall Palace, he sat in silence more often now, staring at the fire, staring at the portraits of women who once held his fate in their hands. Soon, he would no longer hold his own. January 1547. The once mighty King of England lay in his chamber at Whitehall Palace, the curtains drawn against the cold. The man who had reshaped an entire nation, split the church, crushed dissent, destroyed queens, now couldn't walk without pain. His legs oozed with infection. The stench in the room was unbearable. No physicians could help him anymore. Henry VIII was dying, but no one dared say it aloud. Those close to him, his physicians, his advisors, even Catherine Parr, moved like shadows, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of his final days. The king's temper had not softened. Even on the brink of death, he barked orders, accused allies of betrayal, and refused to name his successor outright. Every word he spoke carried weight. Every silence, even more. He had long since stopped seeing himself as mortal. In his mind, he was God's anointed. His body might fail, but his will? Never. And yet, the end came slowly, cruelly. He refused the last rites at first, a sign of weakness, perhaps, or guilt. Only when his breathing grew ragged and his voice slurred did he whisper for a priest. By then, he could barely lift his hand in blessing. Around him, no children gathered, no weeping wives, just a handful of men waiting for the inevitable, each thinking not of Henry, but of what would come after. On January 28th, Henry VIII died. His last words, if they were heard at all, were never recorded. He left behind 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each by a different wife, each marked by his cruelty, and each destined to wear the crown. He also left behind a kingdom fractured by faith, bleeding from war, and haunted by the ghosts of the innocent. His tomb lies next to Jane Seymour, the only wife to bear him a son. But it is not a place of peace. His legacy echoes louder than any monument, a reign of fear, lust, power, and destruction. In the end, Henry VIII got everything he demanded: power, women, a son. But he died alone, feared, and unloved.